Good evening all and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading into the deep woods, and we also have the pleasure of being joined by Papa Scare for 3 of tonight's stories. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I once held a hunting lease in Middle Georgia, an old abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in years. I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately unsettling. The camp sat miles down an overgrown dirt road, completely surrounded by dense wood. It was easily the most secluded place I had ever been to. I hunted there a lot, alone, but no matter how many times I went, I could never shake the feeling that I wasn't really quite alone. There was a locked gate at the front of the property, yet somehow we'd often find the cabin's front door wide open, even when we knew we had locked it. That was creepy for sure, but that's not the part that made me leave for good. One evening I was hunting in a small valley near a food plot we'd planted along a creek that bordered the property. The second I sat down, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but even with a .308 loaded with ballistic-tipped rounds in my hands, I didn't feel like the top predator out there. Still, the forest was alive. Birds calling, squirrels rustling, the usual sounds of a Georgia evening. But then out of nowhere, silence reigned. Everything just stopped. No birds, no insects, no movement. It felt like the entire woods had turned to stare at me. It was getting dark fast anyway, and that eerie quiet had me on edge. So I packed up and started heading back to the cabin. About 100 yards from my stand, that feeling hit me like something was right behind me. I spun around, rifle up, aiming back down the trail towards the food plot. And that's when I saw it. Something stood in the middle of the path. Not a person, not a deer. I could barely make out its shape in the fading light, but it was tall, lean, and wrong. It almost looked like some kind of bipedal deer, but I'd never seen anything quite like it. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring at me. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and booked it back to the cabin, packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I just let the lease run out. Some things just aren't worth knowing. Back in 2003, me and my partner were both living at his mother's house. Most days we'd get home from work at around 5, get dressed, and then we would go into these woods in the hills just outside the town we live in. For context, those woods are a whole 12 miles long and 4 miles wide. There are breaks in the woods with farmland and fields, creating separate woods over these hills with different names. You can walk through these woods if you want. Their paths winding through most of the woods as trails, and if you want to walk over the span of hills from one side to the other, you can if you really want to. There are paths winding through most of the woods as trails, just most of it through the woods and uphill if you're coming from the south. The one we always went to is called Wind Down Woods. So me and my partner would go to these woods nearly every day after we finished work, just to go for a walk, a smoke, or both. We went about doing our usual routine, walking around and talking about our days, following the trail in these woods that loop around a large set of trees, with more around you on the outside. It would kind of look like a messed donut from a bird's level eye view, I guess. We were walking on the path that takes you back up towards the top of the woods. That path also takes you down towards the car park, once you get to the meeting point of all paths. That's when we see this man in the distance walking down the path at point B, the one where the trail just goes up to the woods beyond Wind Down. We've still got to get to the meeting point of all the paths to get back to the car. At this point he's pretty far away from us, but I still had a bad feeling because the first thing I noticed about this man when we got closer was that he was wearing office shoes and carrying a pair of hiking boots while seemingly on a walk in the woods. We were talking about this guy as we were walking up and laughing about how strange it was. The guy was walking faster than us, and he was going downhill and reached the meeting point of the paths a few minutes before we did, but we couldn't see him the whole time. When we got to the meeting point of the paths, all he did was stand there. He didn't do anything. He just stood and was looking around. I had a really bad feeling at this point, as he didn't even look like he was lost. He just looked like he was waiting for something. My partner and I were pretty weirded out at this point, and were thinking about turning away and heading back down the woods and going back around the long way just to get away from his weird-ass vibes. In the end, we decided that walking back down into the woods would ultimately look way too suspicious, as the man had definitely seen us walking up the path towards him at the same time we'd seen him walking down. So we just kept walking up. The whole time this guy was still just standing there and looking around with his shoes in his hand, having no other choice than to walk past him to get down the path to the car park. So we went up and past him. Getting close to him, I saw something that worried me more than it weirded me out. The guy had a backpack on, and there was a handle coming out of it. It was the handle of a hammer or an axe. I knew it couldn't have been anything else. He hadn't been on a phone at all the whole time we'd seen him, not even when he was just loitering around. Just more and more stuff adding up and freaking us out. As we walked past him and started down the path towards the car park, the guy decides he now knows where he needs to go without getting a phone out or a compass, and begins to walk behind us. We were freaking out, and so was my partner, who usually doesn't get paranoid about stuff like this. I do it all the time for no reason, but this guy was not right. There were no other cars in the car park, so he had no reason to be walking there. We were walking as fast as we could without running away from this guy, and after what felt like a lifetime, we got in the car, locked the doors and drove off. Cut to just the other week, and me and my partner are at our friend's house for their birthday, just hanging out, meeting their other friends. We hadn't met them before, but were having a blast. As usual, with every small group hangout, it got late, and we started talking about weird experiences. We'd had spooky encounters, and obviously we told everyone about our encounter with this really strange man in the woods. A couple of the girls at this hangout work at a reserve called Fine Court. It's one of the woods in the hills I've been talking about. They seemed pretty rattled by the story we had told, and said that they had one that would make it worse, but they had to tell the group. So one evening, while Emily was on closing shift with her manager, they'd been cleaning up the cafe and doing final checks, when her manager tells her that he's good doing the rest by himself and for her to just go home. Who doesn't want to hear that? So off she goes to her car, sits there a bit to chill and rolls a cig before driving home. Later that night she gets a text saying, "Don't ask, just don't come into work tomorrow." She finds out that after she left work, her manager had finished cleaning up like he said and had gone to his vehicle to leave. Getting into his car, a man approached him from out of the woods and began wrestling him in an attempt to steal his car keys. Managing to get the man off him and into his car, the manager drove away and called the police. After the police, they connected some dots of a call they had received that evening from a concerned neighbor living in a village a few miles from Fane Court, reporting a suspected burglary at one of her neighbors. Another call from a mental health institute in town, about as far away from ours from these woods in the opposite direction, saying one of their patients had escaped. Turns out the police put the whole story together. This man escaped, got a haircut, and then walked miles to the village in the middle of nowhere. Broke into this house he thought was abandoned, that was actually the home of an elderly couple. The man was completely disabled and wheelchair-bound, and his carer was his wife. The man took the life of the elderly lady and just left the man in the house before leaving and walking into the woods, wandering around them and looking for someone with a car he could steal. That's when he ended up at Fine Court and tried to take her manager's car, running off in the woods again to find someone else. Me and my partner are sure this is the same man we saw acting suspiciously at Windown all that time ago, as their story matched up with ours perfectly in regards to time frames. We would have seen him after he tried to steal the manager's car and ran back off into the woods. The police caught him the next day just wandering around in the woods up there. He was following us back down to the car, but who's going to try and jump two guys in an open space when one of us could have easily made it to the road? I think he was trying to freak us out to get us to go back into the woods when he stopped at that meeting point and was loitering. This still horrifies me to this day, and I'm glad we're still around to share the story. A few years ago, I was working as a consultant for the Provincial Forestry Service, mapping fire lines, fuel loads, ash pits, and fire activity using an IR/LiDAR-equipped drone. The job had me airlifted onto vantage points above active wildfires where I would deploy my equipment, gather data, and then get picked up again by helicopter. After a few days of this, I got into a rhythm, as much as you can when your ride is doing a toe-in landing, while barely sticking the tip of one skid onto a rocky outcrop, just close enough for me to jump out without breaking my neck. Then I had to grab a 70-pound equipment case before it rolled off the ledge. But that morning something felt off. I got dropped onto a ridgeline barely 2 feet wide with a 1,000-foot drop on either side. Below me, the entire mountainside was on fire. The blaze had been aggressive overnight, and the air was thick with smoke and heat. Still, I got to work, flying my mapping route, packing up, and radioing the helicopter for pickup. I could hear it approaching, but I couldn't see it. For 10 minutes I listened, and as it got closer, then moved away. Finally, the pilot radioed back, "We can't pick you up, too much smoke. Can't see the drop point or the alternate." Then came the kicker. "If you walk down to the northeast, the fire isn't as bad there." That's when it hit me. I was a 60-year-old cancer survivor, a partial amputee, standing alone on a mountain with 70 pounds of gear. I was too old for this. I had to haul myself and $55,000 worth of equipment through an actively burning wildfire. So that's exactly what I did. For the next 4 hours, I was certain these were my last moments on Earth. Trees were collapsing around me, burning debris rained down constantly, setting parts of me on fire. Every few steps I had to drop to the ground and roll in the dirt to put myself out. I got hit, burned, and choked on smoke, but kept on moving. Eventually, a team of firefighters found me and guided me to a safe landing zone where the helicopter was waiting. I spent 2 days in the hospital with smoke inhalation and more burns than I could count. Souvenirs from every time I wasn't fast enough to smother the flames. That was my last wildfire. I had the privilege of saying, "Nope, I'm done." But the people who fight these fires by choice, they're different. Crazy in the best possible way, and they have my respect forever. Every year, my friends and I take our families deep into the mountains for our annual camping trip. A place so remote, you could scream for hours and no one would hear you. No cell service, no roads for miles, and at least 200 kilometers from the nearest hospital. It was a tradition, something we looked forward to all year, a chance to escape and feel safe, to be surrounded by people we trusted. Until the year we made the mistake of bringing a stranger. One of my buddies invited a co-worker to join us. He seemed normal enough at first, but from the moment we arrived, something about him felt off. He was trying too hard, too eager to impress, too quick to make jokes about violence, guns, and fights. The kind of guy who needs everyone to know how tough he was. That first night, we were drinking by the fire, laughing, swapping stories, and then the new guy starts getting loud. At first, it was just dumb, awkward jokes, then personal attacks, then full-blown aggression. It was like he was hunting for a fight. When someone finally told him to shut the hell up, he snapped. He lunged at one of our guys, swinging, screaming, and completely out of control. He got thrown to the ground almost immediately, but instead of backing off, he made the worst mistake of his life. He reached for his pistol. I was on my feet before I even had time to think. My rifle was up, 2,000 lumens of tactical light blasting straight into his face, and every muscle of my body was tight, waiting for the next move. One more inch, and I was going to paint the ground with his skull. "Put up your hands or I'll turn your head into a canoe." His entire body locked up. The rage vanished from his face in an instant, replaced with pure animal fear. His hands shot into the air and his voice started shaking. He began whimpering, apologizing, and calling me my friend over and over, like it would somehow save him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that he had just come seconds away from dying. We took every weapon off him, pistol, knives, even a goddamn hatchet, and tossed them on the far side of camp, and made it very clear that he was done. The trip was over. We shoved him into his car and told him not to move until we were gone. I was so pissed that night. I didn't even drive home. I grabbed a motel room in the nearest town, still fuming that my one trip of the year had been ruined. By morning, I figured I'd at least salvage the weekend, maybe head back up and see if he was gone. When I got there, the campsite was empty. His car, his gear, his weapons, everything gone. But right where his car had been parked, sitting alone in the dirt, was a single pair of white briefs, absolutely filled to the brim with feces. The man had been so scared, so completely, utterly broken in that moment, that he had literally defecated himself. To this day, I still laugh about it, and we haven't invited a single newcomer since.
When I was a teenager, like around 13 or 14, one of my mates from school lived in a kind of countryside area. It's hard to describe. We lived in the suburbs, but his area was a little further out, and less suburban looking at the time. This was 25 years ago. I have no idea what it looks like now, by the way. I went to his place to stay from time to time because there was always adventures to be had around his place. One day, he mentions that there are caves near his house, old mine shafts to be more precise. They were in a kind of national park. I was super interested to go check them out with him, so we planned to go the following weekend. And I'd stay over the night before, and we'd set out early the next morning. The weekend came around and we set out around 8 a.m. We went to the supermarket on the way to stock up on drinks and snacks and made our way to the caves. The national park was huge and beautiful. It was a great morning for a hike too. Not too hot and not too cold, with a nice blue-skied sunny day. We came to our first cave in the first 20 minutes of hiking. We grabbed our torches, or flashlights, and went in. It was only short, ending in a small chamber. At the far end of the chamber was a sturdy, locked cage-type gate. My friend told me that some were locked off due to the very real chance of cave-ins or flooding. Since it wasn't too long and it wasn't too dark, with a small amount of sunlight coming in from the entryway, we took a break and ate some snacks. It was good being out and about. I was never a fan of early mornings, but this was an exception. We resumed our trip after that short break and came across several more similar caves. There were a few longer ones with evidence of people using them for underage drinking, candles and beer cans, coupled with shitty teenage graffiti. But these were an exception and not too bad. For the most part, people seemed to respect the caves to an extent and cleaned up after themselves. After about an hour and a half, we came across one that was a bit different from the others. It was a longer one, but evidence of people using it for anything was minimal. I was too embarrassed to say so at the time, but I got a really weird feeling when we entered it. It was weird because we had been in so many, and I felt nothing. But this one just made me feel uneasy. I looked at my mate, and he seemed fine, so I didn't say anything, not wanting to appear soft. When we got to the end where the metal gate was, we found that it was unlocked and open. In fact, when we got closer, the wind seemed to blow it open slightly, although I didn't feel any wind. I got a chill up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like it was inviting us in. Without hesitating, my mate was like, "Let's go." And I was a little taken aback. How could he not be picking up on the bad vibes here? But I ended up not saying anything, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid and didn't want him hassling me later about it. I regret this now. So we went in. It was so dark in there. Our flashlights barely lit a couple of meters ahead of us. The tunnels seemed to go on and on. There was zero evidence of anyone having been there recently. What do you think we'll find? my friend whispered to me. Dunno, I managed to mumble out. Unease was really starting to hit me now, to the point that I was beginning to feel nauseous. And then, it got worse. I felt wind start to blow around my ankles. At first I paid it no mind, but then I thought, where is this sudden wind coming from? The temperature seemed to get colder at each step too. Then I felt the wind brush past my shoulder and face. My heart was beating so hard that I imagined it was echoing in the tunnel. Then I started hearing whispering all around me. It was faint and hard to work out the words. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. When I stopped, it too seemed to stop. And then the most bone-chilling sound I'd ever heard could be heard in the distance in front of us. Low at first, but definitely loud in no time. It was the bellowing scream of a man. One at first, but then I could make out multiple voices. I felt hands start to grab at me, and I could take it no more. I took off in a sprint back towards the exit. I could only half see the way because the hand that I was holding my flashlight with was pumping up and down as it does when you sprint. I scraped my arms, legs, and shoulders against the rough rock walls several times, but I didn't care. It felt like I was running endlessly, but eventually I reached the gate, which I collided into. I thought it would be open still, but for some reason, it was shut. In my panic, I couldn't seem to work out how to open it. Eventually I managed, and it swung towards me, and I left, my mate not far behind me. We finally got out and just kept running, until we finally realized that we were out of that tunnel. Upon realizing this, we collapsed in an exhausted heap, struggling to regain our breath. I'm not proud of this, but I also vomited on myself, due to the overexertion. It was my only shirt for that weekend too, and I had to borrow one of my mates, while we cleaned mine up in secret, because for some reason we thought we'd be in trouble. Just before we got up and left the area where we collapsed, I took one look back at the cave. It was kinda involuntary. I wasn't even thinking. When my eyes landed on that cave entrance, I swear, I could see a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, staring at us. I shot a look at my friend and he saw it too. I was this close to puking again, but I held it down. We got up and hurriedly left the area. That was enough adventure for one day. We went back there a year or so later for nostalgia's sake. Also, we felt bigger and tougher. That particular cave was heavily locked off with no trespassing signs on it, threatening hefty fines. Probably for the best thinking back. Teenage bravado makes young boys do stupid things sometimes, and we may not have escaped so easily a second time.
The first time I took my now wife backpacking, it was supposed to be an easy trip. We followed cougar tracks all the way in. Not a huge deal. It was hard to tell how fresh they were, and they seemed to head up the trail away from us. We pitched the tent, listened to the rain patter against the fabric, and drifted off to sleep. We should have paid more attention to those tracks. Something was watching. When we woke up, something was wrong. The ground outside was covered in cougar prints, every inch. The rain had washed away our own footprints, leaving only one set of tracks, and they circled the tent. This thing had been watching us, studying us and getting closer. You could see where it pressed its nose into the tent, sniffing where our heads were. My side first, then hers. And yet all night we heard nothing. Not a twig snap, not a breath. That thing had been right there and we never knew. We packed up fast. As we hiked back out, we followed two fresh sets of tracks, one larger, one smaller. The cat had never left. It had followed us in. It was following us out. It had been so quiet. Years later we went back. This time it was bears, two black bear cubs, tumbled near the trail, playing, climbing and chasing each other. No sign of the mother. We lingered watching. They were so close, close enough to see the way their little claws dug into the bark as they climbed, and to hear the soft huffs as they played. I pulled out my revolver just in case, and we started walking again, talking loudly so anything nearby would know we were coming. Then my wife froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's right there." I followed her gaze. The mother bear was in the trees to the right of the trail, nearly hidden in the undergrowth. We were right between her and her cubs. I gripped the pistol tighter, heart pounding. If she charged, we were done. No running, no sudden movements, just kept walking. We walked, we talked, and pretended not to see her, and she didn't move. Her head turned slightly as we passed, tracking us, deciding whether we were a threat. Step by step we made distance, and finally I dared to look back. She was still there, still watching. And then, just like that, she went back to foraging. I put my gun away, pulse still hammering, and have never been closer to needing it. And yet, animals don't scare me anywhere near as much as people do. I was camping with friends at the Utica Reservoir off Highway 4 in Northern California. It was after Labor Day, a weekday. That meant the place was empty. So empty it felt like we had the whole reservoir to ourselves. After a few fun days, we packed up to leave, and I decided to take one last hike before heading out. At the dead end of the road near some closed-off trails and the rugged, slick, rock jeep trail, I hiked down to a PG&E lake. It was peaceful, quiet. On my way back up, I wasn't alone anymore. Standing right in the middle of the trail was a man, older, maybe 60, but solidly built, with white hair. I greeted him, he didn't move. All he said was he was waiting for his group to get past some boulders in their jeep, parked about 50 feet up the hill. That's when I noticed a younger man, maybe in his mid-30s, watching from near the jeep. The older man saw my backpack, the name stitched on it, my German last name caught his eye. He grinned, too wide. "Hey, Junior, he's with us. Show him." Junior lifted his shirt. Beneath it, 2 massive swastika tattoos stretching across his stomach. I forced a nod and a smile. I didn't react. I didn't engage. The older man started chatting about guns, how they'd been shooting all morning at some off-road camp nearby. Junior got back in the jeep, slowly rolling down the trail. The old man stepped up beside me, directing his son around some boulders, and I took my chance. I muttered an excuse, turned up the hill, and walked away fast. Then I saw 2 more jeeps, both loaded with men. They watched me pass, and I gave them some forced nod. But this time no one nodded back, they just stared. I didn't run, but my pulse pounded, and I kept walking, feeling their eyes on my back. When I reached my car, I got the hell out of there. I never saw them again. But for the entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that in the middle of nowhere, I had just barely avoided something very, very bad. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing camping trip, a double date in the Stanislaus National Forest, not far from Yosemite. I found the site on freecamps.net, a hidden gem at the bottom of a massive gorge. The road wound down steep switchbacks for nearly an hour before we finally reached the bottom. There were 2 campgrounds along the river, the first full and the second completely empty. That should have been the first red flag. We picked a site between the dirt road and the river, separated from the water by dense sagebrush. Right away something felt off. Near the fire pit we found a rat trap, the old-fashioned kind, metal and brutal. Odd. But what was really weird was the rope, tying it to the grill over the fire pit. Down by the river, we found clothes laid out on a log. Underwear, socks, pants and a shirt. It looked like someone had just left them there to dry, but there was no sign of a person. We shrugged it off. Maybe a hiker went for a swim and they'd be back. Then the sun went down. It was around 9 p.m. when we were sitting around the campfire, unwinding and drinking beer. My back was to the river. My friend sat across from me facing the water, and that's when I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, getting closer, coming from behind me, the riverbank. you guys hear that?" And before anyone could answer, the footsteps broke into a sprint, boots pounding through the brush, charging straight for us. We jumped up. I still had my axe in my hand from chopping wood, and without thinking I raised it and yelled. And just like that silence, the footsteps stopped instantly. We grabbed it and aimed it towards the sound, but there was nothing. The brush wasn't moving, and there were no signs of an animal or a person, just the crackle of fire and our own breathing. For 10 long minutes we stood there scanning the darkness, waiting for something to happen. Then a stick snapped, not random but close and deliberate, like someone was shifting their weight, like someone was right there just out of sight. That was enough. We threw everything into the van, no packing, no second guessing, just go. What was out there? I've been camping my entire life. I've heard animals moving at night and branches snap, coyotes stalk and deer bolt through brush. It was no animal, it was a person, and they were waiting for something. I'm glad we never got to find out what that was exactly. This story is unfortunately true. I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's a really beautiful part of the world with sprawling pines, rugged mountains, and crystalline lakes. I wasn't big on camping, but I spent a good chunk of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends, and spent many summer days tubing on the lake. The summer that I was 16, about 10 years ago now, my cousin Celia had come back from her first year of college, and her boyfriend Jay was visiting to meet her family and friends. Jay, like most tourists, wanted to go on a hike with lake views. Celia and I decided to take him on one of our favorites, a moderate hike through the woods on a gentle incline that peaks at a hollow in the trees overlooking Lake Tahoe below. Jay had some hiking experience, albeit in less rugged terrain, and we thought this hike would be a fun challenge with the spectacular views he wanted. It was in and out of the trail, and it takes about 2 to 3 hours to the top and 2 to 3 hours back down. There are some smaller trails that branch off and offer steeper inclines or winding paths down towards the lake. The three of us set off on the hike on the first Saturday of the visit. The trail isn't the easiest to find, but it's really popular with locals because of the views and general lack of tourists. It was mislabeled on the most popular trails website at the time, so it was hard to find if you didn't know where to look. We passed only a few other hikers, mostly granola-type couples with camelback water backpacks hiking with their dogs. We made it to the top in good time and enjoyed our lunches overlooking the lake. Jay was appropriately impressed by the view and spent a lot of time just taking pictures. In between selfies and bites of sandwiches, we mostly just relaxed and got to know each other. About an hour of relaxing behind us, we heard a scream in the distance, specifically a mountain lion. If you've never heard one, it's really unnerving. It sounds a bit like a very loud, terrified woman letting out a blood-curdling shriek of terror. This was not good, because when a mountain lion screams, it's either part of a mating ritual or two male lions are fighting. Either way, hearing one scream meant that there were multiple mountain lions, and close. The bears in the Sierras are softies, but the mountain lions will attack you. They'll attack your pets. They've been known to attack bikers, and there is safety in numbers, but even 3 is risky if you're talking about a hungry lion. Jag was really freaked out. They weren't big predators roaming around where he's from, and the thought of a large animal, unwilling enough to eat him, was off-putting. Celia and I were wary but not alarmed. Between the natural disasters that frequently occurred in the region, wildfires, earthquakes, and mega-blizzards, and the sometimes deadly wild animals that got near town, we were fairly unshakable. We had seen plenty of bears and snakes on hikes, and sometimes encountered critters. It's the price you pay for enjoying the natural beauty. It also wasn't the first time we heard mountain lions, and we had both seen them before, albeit mostly from the safety of a cabin or a house. There was also an incident where, as kids, we laid out some expensive steak in my backyards in the hopes of luring a mountain lion to take pictures of it. It didn't work, and my mother was very unhappy about the steaks. Anyway, back to the story. Celia and I told Jay that it would be fine, but that we needed to pack it up and get back down the mountain. We packed up the leftovers of our lunches and took off at a brisk pace down the mountain. After 40 minutes into the hike back, Jay realized he forgot his phone at the lookout, in a rush to leave. Of course. After a brief back and forth between Jay and Celia, I don't need it back that badly. Jay, it has all of our pictures from the spring break trip, not to mention you're a broke college student, yes, you need it back. We decided to go back and get it. Well, we decided that Celia and Jay would go back to get it and retrieve his phone, and I would stay there on the trail alone to warn any other hikers that the lions were in the area. I'm mostly worried about those hikers with their off-leash dogs and wanted to prevent a wandering lab from getting mauled. This was obviously not ideal for any of us, but it seemed like the best choice at the time. I found a nice rock to sit on in the shade just off the trail and was going through the pictures we took on my phone and playing Temple Run. There was no cell service or internet, but I knew they'd be back soon. Celia and Jay had been gone for around 50 minutes when I heard the scream again, and it was hard to tell, but I thought it was closer than before. I started to get pretty nervous. Being in groups is far more preferable when dealing with a mountain lion, and I felt like perfect bait sitting there alone in the woods. After about 20 minutes of that, I heard the scream again, and there was now zero doubt that it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from up the trail, towards where Celia and Jay would be coming down. Very soon, I sincerely hoped. Logically, I knew that lions don't scream when they're hunting, they're quiet, and if a lion was hunting me, I wouldn't know it. The screaming meant it was doing something else, something not feeding related. That knowledge did not make me less nervous. I became hyper-alert, whipping my head around every time I heard a noise or thought I saw a flash of movement. I turned my flashlight on, even though it was the middle of the day, and I got off my rock to stand in the middle of the trail to have visibility up and down in the trees on that side of the trail. A few minutes after, I heard it again, extremely close by. At this point, I had full goosebumps and a pit in my stomach, a complete sense of dread. I looked around and tried to find the best place for me to stand, back covered, in case of the worst. I decided to wedge myself up against a tree next to the rock that I had been sitting on. I had good visibility up and down the trail, still, and into the trees across the trail. I continued scanning around, focusing on the up trail where I thought the screams were coming from. Suddenly I saw something, standing still 20 feet up the trail, a couple of feet off it. It was a man. He was completely naked and filthy, skinny, and just standing there looking at me. I didn't even hear him come up. It sounds cliché, but it really was like he appeared out of nowhere, especially since I had been focusing on looking for the line in that direction. If you don't know where you're going, it's easy to get lost in the woods around there. The weather can change quickly, and people panic and get more lost in their attempts to find their cars. And it doesn't take long, being alone, lacking food and water in the wilderness, to make people a little disoriented. The famous Donner Party incident happened maybe an hour away from where I was standing. My first thought was that this man was probably a lost hiker, and judging by how dirty he was, he'd been lost for a long time. He needed help. I heard about people with hypothermia stripping all their clothes off, and thought maybe that's what happened to him. Now this took place during the summer, and there's no way that someone would get hypothermia in July, but that didn't occur to me until later. I began walking towards him and asking if he was okay. Suddenly I got this feeling of wrongness. I don't know how else to describe it, but my feeling of dread tripled. The hair stood up on my neck and I stopped in my tracks, maybe 15 feet away now. I had the overwhelming urge to run away. It seemed wrong, it felt wrong. He looked wrong in every way. I can't quite articulate it. Instead of wanting to help him, I was absolutely terrified. I asked him again if he was all right. He looked at me and opened his mouth wide and screamed. Not a normal scream. He screamed just like a mountain lion, a high-pitched, kneeing shriek that made my blood run cold. It occurred to me that we were probably hearing him the whole time. It was the single most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. I started screaming too. I was preparing to run away, down the trail I suppose, but also really did not want to turn my back to him. Suddenly he closed his mouth, turned around, and ran into the woods very quickly. He disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of wrongness was still with me, and I felt like I was going to vomit. I considered bolting down the trail to get away, but decided to wait for Celia and Jay, who luckily arrived within 10 minutes. I told them what happened, and we decided to call the Rangers when we got service. Celia and I had seen some odd things in our lives here, she more than me, but she turned white as a sheet when I told her what happened. I guess they didn't hear anything all the way down. I've always been deeply unsettled since the incident. Did I see a mentally ill lost hiker who really needed my help? Or someone far more dangerous? Or maybe something paranormal? Celia insists it was a skinwalker or something similar, malevolent and inhuman, mimicking the call of a mountain lion and stalking us down the mountain. But I'll never know for sure, and I'm alright with that.
Until a couple of years back, I was really into solo camping. When I was younger, I used to go with my friends, but as we all got older, they all had their own plans and were really hard to pin down and all agree on the same date. So I ended up just giving up trying to organize. Problem was, I still wanted to go camping. I was the most into it in my group and had a heap of gear just going to waste. So I took the plunge and decided to try going solo. I was a little apprehensive at first, nervous even, but after my first trip I was hooked. I loved the freedom of going at the drop of a hat, doing what I wanted, when I wanted, without having to wait for the others. If I wanted to go after work on Friday, I went. If I wanted to hike early morning, I hiked. If I wanted to eat dinner a little earlier or later, I did. The freedom was intoxicating. I went as often as I wanted, and that was at least 2 times a month. The way I'd usually do it is I'd research parks where camping was allowed that weren't just packed campgrounds. I preferred to hike for at least a couple of hours to ensure I'd be surrounded by nature and with minimal people around me. Some of the places I camped were truly breathtaking. After having done this for some time, I had perfected my loadout. It was just enough gear for the weekend and light enough to hike out for some time. But I'm not here to talk about my gear and such. I'm here to talk about the last time I went solo camping. I arrived at the park around early afternoon after an hour or so drive. I parked the car in the parking area and got all my gear together. I then hiked for about 2 hours until I found a spot I was happy with. It was still late afternoon, so still plenty of light out as I set up my camp. After I pitched my small tent, I set about getting firewood for my campfire. When I was finally done, I got my fire started. Not a moment too soon either, as the sun was setting. I ate some food that I'd brought and settled in for the night, drinking whiskey from a flask I brought by the fire. Tired from the day's activities, I decided to get into my tent a little earlier than usual and read some until I drifted off. It wasn't long before I was sound asleep. I awoke suddenly to the sound of branches cracking and shuffling footsteps. I listened for a bit and tried to convince myself it was just an animal and to go back to sleep. But then I heard it. Similar sounds, but in a different direction. I strained my ears to hear better and could just make out that whatever it was coming towards my tent, but not just from one direction, but 2. There were 2 sets of footsteps coming towards my tent from different directions and seemed to be making little to no effort to conceal themselves. What unnerved me even more was that they sounded bipedal. Whatever it was, I had to think fast. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. It was a gut instinct coupled with the fact that I saw no lights. Firstly, who would be creeping around this far out with no lights on? And secondly, why would there be 2, headed straight for my location from different directions? Something was definitely up, and I didn't want to find out what. I grabbed my pistol and whatever else that was important if I needed to escape in a hurry. I unzipped my tent as silently as possible and slipped out. I headed in the opposite direction to both of the footsteps. When I felt I was far enough away, I hid behind some bushes and watched my campsite. Whilst I did have a gun, I wasn't really the type to use it, let alone threaten others with it, unless I really had to. I only had it for extreme emergencies with wild animals. I never intended to use it on humans, which I now guessed was stalking my camp. I watched and waited for what seemed like an hour, but was probably more likely no more than 5 minutes. I then saw, in the dim moonlight mixed with the dying light of my campfire, a human-shaped shadow slowly appeared to the right of my tent. Not long after, it was joined by another on the left of it. It was too dark to make out exact details, but they both appeared to be carrying something heavy, maybe makeshift clubs. They paused and seemed to communicate with each other. Not sure if it was verbal or not. I was quite a distance away from them, so couldn't really hear, and they were obviously talking in low tones. Then, to my horror, they raised their clubs or whatever they were, in relative unison, and started bringing them down heavily on my once campsite. Again and again, where I had been sleeping not 10 minutes ago. I didn't need to watch. Their intentions were clear. I took off as fast and as quiet as I could. Luckily, they were making a lot of noise. I could hear them, even as I ran. They eventually started hooting and hollering as they destroyed my tent with what they thought was me in it. I am so thankful for my keen sense of direction because I knew which way I had hiked from, even in the dark. I ran the whole way back to my car, or as much as I could, and walked briskly from time to time, but always resumed running when I could. I was back to my car in about 1 to 1.5 hours. When I finally saw it and reached the car park, I almost collapsed from relief. The adrenaline that had propelled me forward that whole time had crashed, and I was starting to shake. I made sure to get into my car and drive a distance away from the car park before I let myself rest. The shock of the situation finally hit me now that I was somewhat safe, and my eyes teared up and I was shaking all over. I was so close to having my life ended that night. The sun was just beginning to rise by the time I was in a coherent enough state, and I called the police to report it, who in turn contacted the park rangers. Even after patrolling the area, the 2 people were never found. So, that's the story of how solo camping almost ended my life.
Backcountry camping has always been a passion of mine, and living in British Columbia means plenty of remote and wild places to explore, along with the very real risk of running into dangerous wildlife. One year we set out on a particularly gnarly trail on Vancouver Island, accessible only by boat. You had to pay some guy to drop you off at the trailhead, then just hope he'd actually come back at the agreed upon date and time. No cell service, no road access, just pure unforgiving wilderness. We were young and reckless back then in 2015, and didn't even bring a satellite phone. The trail itself was a borderline death trap, full of sketchy crossings where you'd have to balance on fallen logs over cliff edges. But the real adrenaline rush came when we finally made it above the tree line, only to come face to face with a mama bear and her cubs. She instantly sent them scrambling up the only tree in sight, one of those pathetic little alpine stumps that offered zero real protection. We knew running wasn't the right move, but with her cubs behind her, there was no way she was backing down. So we did the only thing that felt right in that moment. We ran. Dumb, yeah, but somehow she got lucky. She stayed with her cubs instead of chasing us down. That wasn't the only thing that got dicey on that trip. The trail was about 25 kilometers to the first campsite, and we were spread out, using whistles to keep track of each other. At one point I found myself alone in a valley clearing halfway between my group. The trail was overgrown, and after stopping for a quick snack, I realized I wasn't entirely sure which way was forward or backward. I blew my whistle, expecting a response from my friends. Instead, I heard another whistle from my side, then another from a different direction. It took me a few beats to realize I was hearing some kind of bird mimicking the sound. That's when it really hit me how easy it would have been to wander off trail and disappear. Thankfully, one of my friends showed up in time, and I was able to carry on with him. As if that trip wasn't wild enough, we ran into the only other hikers on the trail, a group of 3 girls heading out. They looked rattled when we asked what happened, and they told us that the night before they had to camp on the trail because it got too dark to reach the trailhead. While setting up their tent, a wolf wandered straight into their campsite. It didn't attack, but it also didn't leave right away. They had nothing but an axe to defend themselves, and as they told the story, all I could think about was that our group had nothing but bear spray and pocket knives. Sometimes I wonder if I should buy a gun for trips like that. But we're older now, and don't push as hard as we used to. Looking back, I can't believe how wildly unprepared we were, but somehow we made it out. I was camping in Tsavo National Park in southern Kenya when I woke up to the deep, bone-rattling roar of lions, their calls answered by distant elephants. Nothing triggers the primitive part of your brain like waking up to the sound of a lion roaring nearby. I crawled out of my tent and found my tracker and guide, Chewbacca, already tending the fire. He had it built higher. Fire keeps them away. A few hundred yards away, another camper was alone in his tent. As I sat by the flames, his tent started moving. The zipper rasped open, and suddenly he bolted full sprint to his Land Rover parked about 50 feet away, diving inside and slamming the door. It was almost comical at the time. When morning came, I counted over 35 lions lounging near our camp. You have to understand, this spot was too close to where the infamous Tsavo man-eaters had hunted over a century before. In 1907, 2 massive maneless male lions, one black, one white, systematically killed 135 railroad workers. The Ghost in the Darkness tells their story, but Hollywood toned it down. The true story is far worse, and they weren't even the first. I had spent hours unable to sleep, listening to the roars echo through the darkness. My girlfriend thought I was insane for sitting up by the fire instead of staying in the tent. Eventually she climbed out too, muttering she had to use the bathroom, which was an old, crumbling bunkhouse on the far side of the enclosure. I asked our guide if it was safe to go, and he shrugged. I gestured for the axe he had for chipping firewood. "If they come for you," he said, "an axe will do no good. Best go fast and be quiet." I was 22, halfway across the world, and had already faced some insane things, but this was next level. The walk to the bunkhouse felt like a night safari from hell. The thorned acacia plants meant to keep the lions out had clearly failed. Panicked animals darted in and out of my flashlight beam. A gazelle, a wildebeest, and even a mother giraffe and her calf taller than me thundered past. Somewhere in the blackness, something huge crashed through the brush. Then an explosion of sound. An elephant trumpeted in fury, and a lion roared in agony. Did the elephant step on a lion? I don't know how else to describe the sheer violence of the noise. We reached the bunkhouse, a long, narrow, rotting building. There was no electricity, no generator humming in the night, and the darkness was absolute. I latched the door behind us. The place was silent, except for the symphony of animals outside. It had been painted entirely dark green. Walls, ceilings, and floors were now faded and peeling. A worn path cut through the middle of the floor, leading deeper inside. The bunk beds were gone, salvaged long ago. My girlfriend disappeared into the bathroom, and I stood there in the pitch dark listening. Something shifted, a faint thump, then a scratching sound. The noise came from the far end of the building, and my adrenaline spiked. I pulled out my camping knife. The toilet flushed. My girlfriend muttered something about the faucet not working, and then she opened the door. "Why's your flashlight off?" I'd forgotten about it. I flicked it on, scanning the room. But something was wrong. "I heard something," I tell her. and she froze. We both decided it was time to go. Halfway back through the bunkhouse, she grabbed my arm. "Was that there before?" And I shone my light over to where she pointed. There, smeared along the wall, were bloody handprints low to the ground, fingers together tilted at unnatural angles. They hadn't been there before. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. A wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't a place for pranks. This was in the deep bush of Africa, where you could die from lions, poachers, snakes, and 1,000 other things. We hurried to the door, one small flashlight leading us forwards, the bloody handprint and crushing darkness behind. Outside the chaos of the lions was a relief. Back at camp, I hesitated and asked our guide if anything out here was haunted. He didn't even look up from the fire. "Spirits, good and bad, are everywhere," he said, and told me not to be surprised when I saw things I didn't understand. A few hours before dawn, the lions finally quieted. I managed to sleep. In the morning, we broke camp before leaving, and we took a final count. 38 lions, an almost unheard of massive pride. Those handprints. Maybe one day, I'll return. I also went solo camping on a remote beach in Northern California, miles away from civilization, cliffs towering over the roaring ocean. It was stunningly beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I'd been to plenty of remote places, even grew up on the northern coast of San Francisco, but this was different. On my way in, I passed a couple hiking out. They looked normal and we exchanged quick hellos and nothing more. I spent 3 days out there and didn't see another soul. A week later, the news reported that 2 people had been decapitated in their tent. Their lives ended in their sleep. The news showed the location, and it was almost exactly where I had camped. I don't know if it was that couple I passed. I don't know who did it. And as far as I'm aware, no one ever caught them. This was my third unsettling experience in the last couple of years in the state gamelands of northeastern Pennsylvania. A few days ago, I was hiking with my 2 dogs on some familiar trails, parts of which ran along the power lines. I know this area well. I grew up just on the other side of them. But this time I came from a different route than the one I used when I lived nearby. Most of the hike was uneventful, until I veered onto an old, overgrown quad trail leading to an abandoned quarry about 2 miles in. My dogs, usually eager to lead the way, were hanging back behind me. Strange, but they were still exploring, darting in and out of the underbrush, so I didn't think much of it. Then, as I crested the trail into a small clearing, I heard it. A low voice. "Help!" I froze, scanning the woods around me. My dog stayed close but didn't react, not even a bark or a growl. That was unusual. If there had been a person nearby, they would have known before I did. I kept walking slower now, my skin prickling. Then I heard it again. "Turn back." That was enough for me. My gut twisted and my dogs, who had been eerily silent, suddenly seemed tense, their bodies low, ears flicking in all directions. Without hesitation, I turned around and headed back the way we came, walking fast but controlled. If it had been an actual person, my dogs would have reacted differently. They always did. Given my past experiences in these woods, I'm convinced it was the mimic. I've encountered it before, and the fact that this happened on my first hike in these woods in over a year is what unsettles me the most. I experienced thunder snow while camping on Death Canyon Shelf in the Tetons. It started as a normal storm, then boom, lightning exploded across the sky, so close the air reeked of ozone. It was relentless, one strike after another, flashing so fast it was like someone had turned on a strobe light in the mountains. My husband and I crouched inside our tent, trying to minimize contact with the ground, waiting for the next bolt to find us. Then suddenly, it was bright outside. For one heart-stopping second, we thought it was a forest fire, but no. 4 inches of snow had fallen in 30 minutes, and the storm wasn't done. Later on the same trip, late season, bone-dry summer, we were pushing into a high pass above the tree line when my husband spotted storm clouds rolling in. He panicked. Lightning up here? No cover, nowhere to hide? He picked up the pace, too fast, pushing hard despite the 90-degree heat. His pack was way heavier than mine and he ran out of water. We passed dry stream after dry stream, everyone marked blue on the map, but empty in person. Then he started getting dizzy. A bold blue line lay a mile ahead on the map. I left him behind with our gear and sprinted forward to find water. Then I found it, a stream. As I crouched to fill the water, movement caught my eye, and a little brown head popped up across the water, then another. A grizzly with cubs. I was alone. No one had been on the trail for hours. My husband was a mile away, too weak to help even if he could. I did everything right. Stood tall, made noise, waved my arms, and she did everything right. Watched me, calculated, and moved on. I couldn't breathe until she left. I forced myself to walk back to my husband, and when I was finally safe, when the adrenaline crashed, I broke down and cried. This was the best trip I've ever taken, but every day something tried to kill us. Thunder, snow, hypothermia, bears, hailstorms, and dehydration. It's one thing to know what you're supposed to do in these situations, and another when you're standing face to face to them.
Let's get one thing straight. I've hiked the Blue Mountains before, but nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced during what was supposed to be a routine trek through its canyons. It began as a clear morning, the kind Aussies brag about. The eucalypt haze that gave the Blue Mountains their name wrapped around the cliffs in a dreamy shroud. I set off from Katoomba, pumped for a day of solitude and the haunting beauty of the Gross Valley. Honestly, I should have turned back when I first felt that tingle on my neck, the one you get when you think someone's watching you. But being the dauntless bloke I pretend to be, I chalked it up to the chill of the mountain air. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, mind set on the shifting shadows between the gum trees, and that's when I got lost. The paths here wind around and double back like a snake. I've trekked them plenty, but today they had teeth, and they bit me, hard. Hours passed, and I realized I was properly stuffed. Night fell like a curtain, fast, unforgiving. I've never known dark like that, not the city kind. This was a velvety, pressing darkness that oozes into your bones and stays there. My phone's flashlight cut through it like a weak whisper against the thunderstorm. Every tree looked like a gnarled hand, and every bush rustle felt like a warning. Here's the goosebump bit. I wasn't alone. Not once did I see it clearly, but by the twitch of twilight, there was something behind me, a presence that hummed with malice. You know those stories of Aussie spirits? The ones old-timers talk about in hushed tones by the fire? I'd laugh them off, but out here, laughter was about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. It felt like a hunt, and I was the quarry, stumbling over roots, my breath a ragged prayer. My phone beeped a low battery warning. Seriously, now? I pushed through the bush, gripping the phone like a talisman. But even text cold comfort was slipping away. The hours to dawn stretched eternal. My world shrunk to the feeble circle of my dying light. When the brush gave way to an open dirt road, it felt like a mirage. I was giddy with relief, like this was some twisted, outback Wizard of Oz junk. There wasn't a yellow brick road, but I'd have kissed the dirt if I hadn't been so parched. I followed it, boots crunching. When the ranger station silhouetted against a night, I could have wept. The ranger was a bloke named Darryl. Look of a man who's seen it all, and then some. He listened to my tale with a grave nod and gave me a lift back to my ute. throwing glances to the rear view, like he expected my ghostly mate to be thumbing a ride. "Don't hike alone," he said, his voice almost lost in the engine's growl. "Especially not when the mountain's restless." I haven't been back since. People say it was all in my head. Dehydration, panic, the bush playing tricks. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, when the city's asleep and my flat's quiet, I swear I hear that whisper of a presence. Feel that shiver down my spine. Sydney's got enough to explore without looking for trouble. You ever find yourself up in the Blue Mountains? Stick to the beaten path. And for the love of all that's holy, respect the signs, both the ones in the ground and the ones in the gut. And bring a bloody good torch.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the stories, and a huge thank you to Papa Scare for joining me in tonight's video. If you enjoyed his narrations, feel free to check out his channel that can be linked in the description and found in the cards at the end. A huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Your support means the world. Thank you. But for now, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome. See you tomorrow for Cryptids, and have a good night.